Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the moment the gunshot tore through the quiet night. Everything unraveled with terrifying speed. Trina's ears rang with the deafening echo, her heart pounding as though it might break free from her chest. She and Kai rushed into the room where Drew lay sprawled across the polished floor, his body limp, his shirt blooming crimson as blood poured freely. The metallic tang of iron filled the air, mingling with the suffocating silence that followed the chaos. Drew was alive, but barely, his shallow breaths rattling in his chest as his pulse weakened. Trina, trembling but determined, instinctively reached for her phone, her only thought to call for help before it was too late. Yet Kai's hand clamped down on hers, his voice low, urgent, and unyielding as he pulled her back. He warned her that staying would destroy them both, that being discovered at the scene would brand them as guilty regardless of the truth. Against every instinct in her body, Trina allowed him to drag her away, leaving Drew to bleed alone on the cold floor. That single decision would haunt her with merciless persistence, clawing at her conscience every time she closed her eyes. It was Tracy who found Drew moments later. She entered the room expecting confrontation, not carnage, and was met instead with the horrifying sight of his near-lifeless form. A cry of disbelief escaped her as she dropped to her knees, grabbing the nearest blanket to press against the wound, desperate to stanch the flow of blood. With shaking hands, she dialed 911, her voice raw and frantic as she begged for an ambulance. By sheer force of will, Tracy kept him alive long enough for paramedics to arrive. Drew was rushed to the hospital, his condition critical, a bullet lodged dangerously close to his spine. He was whisked into surgery immediately, the operating room becoming his last fragile thread between life and death. News of the shooting spread across Port Charles like wildfire, leaving the town reeling in shock. The incident marked the beginning of a fresh wave of turmoil, a storm that would engulf everyone connected to Drew. Meanwhile, Kai and Trina returned to the suffocating quiet of her apartment, their silence deafening. Every glance between them carried unspoken blame, fear, and a fragile trust teetering on the edge of collapse. Trina's hands shook as she tried to wash away the invisible stains of blood, the smell of it still clinging to her skin. She wanted to confess, to turn herself in, to admit she had abandoned Drew, but Kai's voice cut through her panic like a blade. He insisted they had no choice. If they spoke, if they told anyone the truth, their lives would be destroyed. Yet beneath his resolve, guilt gnawed at him too, though he buried it under a mask of control. The silence between them became its own prison, a constant reminder of the night's grim reality. The investigation began almost instantly. Anna Devane and Dante Falconeri arrived at Drew's house within hours, examining the scene with the precision of seasoned investigators. What they found was troubling. There were no signs of forced entry. The locks were untouched, the windows unbroken, and the front door slightly ajar. It was clear that Drew had let his attacker inside willingly, or that the shooter had been someone he trusted. This discovery shifted the focus of the investigation dramatically. Whoever fired the shot wasn't a stranger, it was someone close. As evidence was collected, patterns emerged that pointed uncomfortably in one direction: Kai. His fingerprints were everywhere, in doorknobs, glasses, and surfaces that gave no logical explanation for his presence. Worse still, a discarded handgun was discovered in a nearby trash bin, its surface smeared with partial prints that matched his. Every piece of evidence piled higher against him, constructing a damning narrative he couldn't escape. When Kai and Trina were summoned to PCPD for questioning, Trina tried to hold on to her hope. She believed she could explain, that she could tell the truth about their panic, their flight, and somehow clear their names. But the officer's questions quickly chipped away at her confidence. Why had they been at Drew's house in the first place? Why hadn't they called for help? Why did Kai's prints cover the weapon? Each question tightened the noose, making Trina's answers sound increasingly hollow. Her heart sank as she realized that logic and innocence meant nothing when every shred of evidence contradicted her words. The harsh reality hit her when both she and Kai were officially placed under arrest. The cold click of handcuffs echoed louder than the gunshot had, sealing their fate in steel. Trina's eyes burned with tears she fought to hold back as she was led into an interrogation room, her mind replaying the moment she walked away from Drew. Across the hall, Kai sat alone, expression unreadable, though his silence carried the weight of a man already accepting blame. He knew the evidence was stacked against him, knew that his own decision to shield Trina from suspicion might end with him taking the fall entirely. For the first time, the loyalty that bound him to her might cost him his freedom. The nightmare was only beginning, and as the walls of PCPD closed in, both Kai and Trina understood that their lives had changed forever. They were no longer just bystanders caught in the chaos. They had become the prime suspects in one of Port Charles' darkest crimes. Trina's panic did not fade once she was released from custody. It intensified with every hour that passed. The memory of Drew bleeding out on the floor refused to leave her mind, playing in endless, tortuous loops that gnawed at her sense of morality. She could still feel the sticky warmth of his blood on her hands, still hear the faint rasp of his breath as she turned away. That choice that one Kai had insisted upon had splintered her from within. Now, under the weight of the relentless interrogation, the sharp questions hurled at her by detectives, she found herself unraveling. Each accusation made her doubt her own ability to defend herself. Every time she tried to explain, her words tangled, coming out as half-truths and contradictions that only deepened suspicion. Yet what unsettled her most was not the investigators' doubt but Kai's startling decision to shoulder all the blame. In the cold confines of the interrogation room, Kai's confession had stunned her. He told the officers that he had been the one holding the gun, that the blood on his hands was proof enough of his guilt. The details of his story were fractured, riddled with inconsistencies that any sharp-eyed investigator should have noticed. But the police, eager to close the case quickly and with an easy suspect, latched onto his words. His fingerprints on the discarded weapon became irrefutable evidence. His presence at the crime scene, combined with his silence during crucial moments, painted a picture the detectives were all too willing to accept. To them, Kai's confession was the missing puzzle piece that neatly completed their case. As a result, Kai's fate was sealed with unnerving speed. He was charged with attempted murder, his bond denied, and the full weight of the justice system came crashing down upon him. Trina, though spared immediate incarceration, was not free. She was placed under strict surveillance, warned that her movements would be monitored, and reminded that she was not absolved but merely tolerated until further notice. Her release brought no relief, only the heavy burden of guilt and helplessness. When Portia received the news, it nearly destroyed her. She had spent years trying to shield Trina from the shadows of Port Charles, from the dangerous entanglements that came with its alliances and betrayals. Now, despite all her efforts, her daughter had been pulled into the darkest kind of scandal. Portia's fear went beyond maternal instinct. She knew that Drew's shooting could unearth secrets she had fought to keep, buried secrets about her own choices and alliances. Secrets that could easily turn suspicion in her direction if the investigation widened its net. Every instinct in her screamed to protect Trina, to stand between her daughter and the storm, but the threat felt larger than anything she could fight alone. Curtis reacted with anger that barely concealed his guilt. He could not ignore the ugly truth. His rivalry and manipulation of Drew had set off a chain of events that spiraled into disaster. His schemes had made Drew enemies, had pushed him into corners where violence was inevitable, and now his daughter was caught in the crossfire. The rage he directed at Kai was born not only from suspicion but from his own remorse. Deep inside, Curtis understood that if he had not been so intent on outmaneuvering Drew, none of this might have happened. His rage became a mask for his regret, and his frustration with Portia's desperation only drove a wedge further between them. Portia's determination did not falter, however. She met with lawyers, pressed Anna for updates, and sought every possible angle to disentangle Trina from the investigation. Her pleas, however, collided with Kai's immovable resolve. He refused to retract his confession, refused even to allow the slightest doubt to fall back on Trina. His loyalty was as absolute as it was reckless. To him, imprisonment was a price worth paying if it guaranteed Trina's safety. His silence in the face of mounting evidence was both maddening and heartbreaking. He became, in his own mind, the shield that stood between her and destruction. For Trina, the weight of that shield was unbearable. She lay awake at night, haunted by the contradiction of knowing Kai's innocence while watching him willingly march toward ruin. Every fiber of her being told her to fight for him, to expose the truth, to speak up. Yet another part of her whispered that breaking his shield would only doom them both. If she contradicted his confession, would the police turn on her again? Would they drag her mother into the mess? Would Drew's family demand retribution from her as well? These questions gnawed at her sanity, leaving her trapped in an endless spiral of guilt and indecision. The shadows of the shooting loomed over every step she took. At home, she felt the piercing gaze of neighbors who whispered about her involvement. At school, friends approached with false smiles that barely masked their curiosity and judgment. Even in her most private moments, she could not escape the voice inside her reminding her of the choice she had made to leave Drew bleeding and to follow Kai into the night. That memory pressed down on her like a hand at her throat, making it harder to breathe. The irony was cruel. The very man she knew had not fired the shot was now painted as the town's villain, and her silence made her complicit in the lie. Kai sat behind bars, calm in his sacrifice, while Trina walked free, shackled instead by invisible chains of guilt. And as the case against Kai built momentum, with prosecutors preparing for trial and Portia fighting desperately from the outside, Trina knew that the truth would not stay buried forever. The day would come when she would be forced to choose protect herself by maintaining the lie, or risk everything to free Kai from a punishment he did not deserve. Either choice threatened to destroy her. And with Drew's life hanging in the balance at the hospital, the moral weight of her decision threatened to consume her completely. While Drew remained on the operating table, his life balanced precariously between survival and tragedy. The shockwaves of the shooting rippled through Port Charles with merciless force. News of what had happened spread with terrifying speed, each retelling more frantic than the last, until the entire town seemed consumed by panic. At the hospital, hushed whispers filled the waiting room, the sterile scent of antiseptic only heightening the dread that clung to everyone's skin. Doctors and nurses moved with brisk determination, their faces taut with urgency as they fought to keep Drew alive. For those who loved him, every minute felt like an eternity. Willow was among the first to crumble beneath the weight of the news. When Chase gently broke it to her, his voice low but edged with the fear he could not mask, her knees buckled, and the world tilted. Overwhelmed by grief and disbelief, she collapsed into his arms. Chase, though rattled himself, held her tightly, whispering reassurances he barely believed, his embrace the only anchor keeping her from shattering completely. For Willow, the thought of losing Drew was unbearable. He had been her lifeline through hardship, her anchor during storms. The possibility of his death reopened every wound she thought she had healed, and the sight of her fainting into Chase's arms spoke of a despair that words could not capture. At the Quartermain mansion, the atmosphere was no less harrowing. Michael walked through the front door drenched from the rain, his shoulders heavy, his expression hollow. He found Brooklyn comforting Wiley, who clutched a cup of hot chocolate, his small hands trembling as he tried to make sense of the tension around him. The boy had woken from a nightmare, asking for his father, only to be met with silence and anxious glances. Michael knelt beside him, forcing a smile through his own anguish, and assured his son that everything would be all right. But inside, he was drowning in despair. The truth was that nothing felt all right. The family he had worked so hard to protect was once again fractured, once again staring down the barrel of fate's cruelty. He leaned on Brooklyn for strength, but the shadows in his eyes betrayed the depth of his hopelessness. Carly, meanwhile, was unraveling in her own private torment. Alone with her thoughts, she replayed every misstep, every decision, every moment where she had chosen to doubt Drew, to mistrust his motives, to assume the worst of him. The weight of her misjudgments pressed on her chest until she could scarcely breathe. Had her suspicions, her accusations, and her inability to extend compassion pushed him deeper into danger? She could not shake the possibility that she had, in some way, contributed to this catastrophe. Carly prided herself on her instincts, yet those very instincts had betrayed her. The realization gnawed at her, leaving her caught between shame and the desperate need to atone. Far from the public eye, another thread of the story began to unravel in the shadows. Jason, on his way out of town, received a call that froze him in place. The voice on the other end was Brit's, panicked and urgent, her words broken by static and fear. She begged for his help, insisting that something much larger was at play, that Drew's shooting was not just the act of a lone gunman but the symptom of a deeper conspiracy. Her plea hinted at hidden forces pulling the strings, faceless players manipulating events to their advantage. Jason's pulse quickened as the implications sank in. Kai, already cast as the convenient villain, might simply be a pawn, pushed into the spotlight to bear the brunt of suspicion while the true masterminds remained untouched. The possibility shifted the entire perspective of the crime. If Britt was right, then Drew's shooting was not random, not personal, but part of a carefully orchestrated plan. It meant that Kai's arrest, his confession, and the overwhelming evidence against him might all be pieces of a larger puzzle designed to shield the true culprits from exposure. Jason knew the city's underworld too well to dismiss such a theory. He had seen how power could twist justice, how scapegoats were created to protect the untouchable. But knowing this and proving it were two entirely different battles. For now, Kai sat behind bars, the charges against him growing heavier by the day. His resolve to protect Trina and Portia only deepened the trap, ensuring that he would remain in custody as the legal system closed in on him. He was isolated, painted as a monster by the media, and left with few allies. The walls of his cell became both his shield and his prison, keeping him safe from the chaos outside but condemning him to face punishment for a crime he likely had not committed. As Drew's surgery dragged on and the town held its breath, the narrative hardened. Families mourned, loved ones wept, and the citizens of Port Charles demanded justice. But justice in this town was rarely simple. Behind the grief and outrage, darker forces moved in silence, manipulating evidence, steering blame, and ensuring that the truth remained buried. Kai's fate, Drew's survival, and the fragile peace of the Quartermaines and their allies were no longer just personal struggles, they were battlegrounds in a larger war. One where unseen enemies controlled the pieces, and the game was far from over. Kai's first night in the holding cell was one of silence, shadows, and unrelenting weight. The clang of the door echoed like a judgment pass, final and merciless. The concrete floor was cold against his skin, the narrow cot little more than a slab, but none of it mattered. What cut deeper than the steel bars was the knowledge of why he was there, on it because he had pulled the trigger, but because he had willingly chosen to bear the blame so that Trina and Portia might escape its crushing weight. His eyes, hardened in the presence of the officers, carried a determination that masked the turbulence within. On the surface he looked resolute, but beneath that stillness lived an ache, a quiet desperation rooted in the sacrifice he had made. He had surrendered his freedom, and perhaps even his future, to protect them. Yet, even as he sat confined, Kai held on to a fragile hope that the truth, however buried, would eventually find its way into the light. The irony was merciless. Kai knew the confession he had offered was riddled with holes, inconsistent in ways that any thorough investigator could have spotted. Yet in the eyes of the PCPD, it was exactly what they wanted, a story that fit, a suspect who confessed, and a case that seemed neatly tied together. His fingerprints on the weapon, his unexplained presence in Drew's home, his decision to remain silent when Drew bled on the floor, each piece stacked against him, painting a damning portrait. For the police, Kai's confession was not just evidence, it was closure. For Kai, it was a shield, one that came at the cost of his own freedom. Outside the cell, Trina struggled under a different kind of imprisonment. Though released under supervision, she walked through Port Charles carrying the weight of unspoken guilt. Every glance felt accusatory, every whisper a reminder of the night she had chosen to follow Kai instead of saving Drew. She replayed the scene endlessly in her mind, Drew's shallow breaths, the dark pool spreading beneath him, and the terrible choice to turn away. The guilt suffocated her, leaving her restless, unable to find peace in her own skin. Worse still was the knowledge that Kai's confession was designed to protect her. His willingness to sacrifice himself cut her deeply, leaving her torn between gratitude and despair. She knew he was innocent, yet her silence allowed the lie to stand. Portia's anguish was no less consuming. The revelation that her daughter was entangled in such a scandal nearly shattered her. She had fought for years to protect Trina from the dangerous currents of Port Charles, to shield her from the mistakes and betrayals that had defined so much of her own past. Yet here was the proof that her efforts had failed. Worse, Portia understood that Drew's shooting might not only ruin Trina's future but also unearth secrets she had long buried. There were choices in her past, decisions made in desperation, that if exposed could brand her a target as well. The fear of losing her daughter to the justice system and the fear of her own life unraveling pressed against her from both sides, leaving her in a constant state of dread. Curtis, too, was consumed by his own torment. Outwardly, he raged against Kai, condemning him as reckless, dangerous, and untrustworthy. Yet beneath the anger lay a bitter truth he could not ignore. His own rivalry with Drew had played a role in this catastrophe. His schemes and power struggles had created the perfect storm, a climate in which Drew was left vulnerable to attack. Deep inside, Curtis feared that his actions had paved the way for the shooter, that his relentless push for dominance had drawn Drew into a trap from which he could not escape. His anger at Kai became a mask for guilt he could not face, and every time he raised his voice, he was trying as much to silence himself as to condemn another. Meanwhile, Drew lay in a sterile hospital room, his life in the balance. Surgeons fought tirelessly to remove the bullet lodged near his spine, each movement delicate, each second critical. Machines beeped in a rhythm that carried both hope and dread, their sounds echoing in the hearts of those who waited outside. His survival was uncertain, and that uncertainty held enormous consequences. If Drew lived, he could reveal the truth, identify the shooter, and unravel the lies. If he died, Kai's confession would become the final word, sealing his fate and cementing him as the man who had nearly taken Drew's life. The outcome of one surgery held the power to decide the futures of them all. The town itself seemed to vibrate with tension. In Port Charles, news traveled fast, and speculation faster. Some were convinced Kai was guilty, pointing to his troubled past and his suspicious loyalty shifts. Others whispered doubts, noting how cleanly the case had wrapped up, how conveniently the evidence aligned. Conspiracy theories sprouted in hushed tones at Kelly's diner, in the corners of the Savoy, in the alleys where shadows lingered longer than they should. The idea that Kai might be a scapegoat gained traction, but without proof, suspicion was nothing more than smoke dissipating into the night. Jason's sudden re-entry into the narrative only deepened the mystery. Britt's desperate call had shaken him, her words a frantic warning that Drew's shooting was part of something far larger. To Jason, the pieces began to fall into place. He had seen too many carefully orchestrated deceptions to dismiss the possibility. Powerful players, unseen and untouchable, were maneuvering the board, and Kai had been sacrificed as the pawn. Jason knew what it meant. The real shooter was still out there, protected by a veil of manipulation. And if the wrong people gained too much ground, then Drew's blood would not be the last to stain Port Charles. Back in his cell, Kai tried to find strength in his solitude. He told himself that silence was his weapon, that his sacrifice would be enough to shield Trina and Portia. Yet doubt crept in during the long hours of the night. How long could he hold the weight of a lie before it broke him? Would the truth ever surface, or would his false confession become reality in the eyes of the law? He imagined Trina's face, torn between sorrow and determination, and prayed she would find the strength he had denied himself. For Kai, the future was no longer about his freedom, it was about whether those he cared for could endure the storm that had begun with a single gunshot. The shadow of that shot stretched across the entire town, haunting every corner, every heart. It was more than an act of violence, it was the spark that had ignited a chain reaction of betrayals, secrets, and revelations yet to come. In the days ahead, Port Charles would watch as the lives of Drew, Kai, and Trina unraveled further, caught in a web of lies and half-truths. The truth was still out there, buried under layers of deceit, and sooner or later it would claw its way to the surface. But until that moment arrived, the darkness lingered, its grip unrelenting, its presence a reminder that nothing in Port Charles was ever as simple as it seemed.